Hey everyone, so we're going to continue on with chapter 20, and our next topic is going to be the electrical system of the heart. We call it the conduction system. So how does the heart muscle conduct electricity in order to coordinate a heartbeat? And it's a pretty precise process. And so let's go to our PowerPoint and let's go through this cardiac muscle, the cardiac conduction system. Now, to start off with, to kind of introduce this, it says cardiac muscle cells are autorhythmic. That means they can make their own electricity. They are self-excitable. You see, our skeletal muscles are not like this at all. The skeletal muscles need a signal from our nervous system to contract. But heart muscles do not need this. The heart actually produces its own electrical impulse to cause the heartbeat. So it says they repeatedly generate spontaneous action potentials that trigger the heart to contract. So it is true that a heart can beat outside the body. It doesn't need the nervous system to beat. It's going to generate its own heartbeat. So it says these cells that do this are a pacemaker, and they set a rhythm for the entire heart. And this pacemaker kicks off what's called the conduction system, which is the route of action potentials traveling through the heart in a coordinated way to allow the heart to beat properly and pump the blood through the heart properly in the way that we described in Handout 20A. All right, so these autorhythmic cells form this conduction system. Now, I don't really like this slide a whole lot. It gives you a list of the components of the conduction system, so Cyanoatrial Node and the Interventricular Node and so on. We'll get into that in Handout 20B here. But what happens is that signals from our autonomic nervous system, along with some hormones like epinephrine, which is just the fancy word for adrenaline, are going to trigger the heart to beat faster, but the fundamental rhythm of the heart is established by the heart itself. So in other words, we can speed up the heart with hormones. We can speed up the heart with our nervous system. Our brain can send a signal telling the heart to beat faster when we're running. But the heart itself establishes the fundamental rhythm. All right? Now, this fundamental rhythm is going to move through the heart in a systematic way. All right? So it says that the rhythm of the conduction system starts at the SA node, and it moves from the SA node to our AV node, and then through the rest of the heart. So let's look here at Handout 20B, and we'll get an idea of how this heart is going to move electrical signals. So I am going to disappear, and we are going to look at basically the top left of this Handout 20B. Handout 20B has more to it than just the conduction system. It's actually a pretty useful handout because it shows EKGs and that kind of stuff. But let's follow the heart pathway or electrical pathway. So the Cyanoatrial Node is a little patch of heart tissue on the right atrium. And it is where this all begins. It starts the fundamental action potential that then spreads through the heart. So your Cyanoatrial Node is where this all begins. So the Cyanoatrial nodes generate an electrical impulse, an action potential. That action potential then spreads through the atria. So it goes from the cyanoatrial node through all of our atrial muscle cells, which is, I've color-coded this. So yellow is the cyanoatrial node. Then it flows through the atria, which is the green. And the action potentials then arrive at this area right here at the top of our interventricular septum called the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node accepts that action potential and then kicks it and spreads it into the ventricles. Now, the ventricles are divided by this interventricular septum. Remember, it's this big divider that goes through the middle of the heart. So the conduction system is going to move from the AV node through this atrioventricular septum. And there's a short little segment here called the bundle of His, and then that bundle of His branches. And so we have a left and right bundle branch that carries the electrical signal through the interventricular septum. And then from there, it reaches the apex of the heart where it spreads out through these muscle fibers called the Purkinje fibers, which then spread the action potential through the ventricle. And that causes, it's hard to read here, but that causes the ventricular muscles to contract. So it spreads all through the ventricles. And that is always, for every heartbeat, how the electrical action potentials move through the heart. So the cyanoatrial node triggers it, spreads it through the atria. The electrical signal goes from the atria to the AV node. From the AV node, it goes through the bundle of His, splits and goes through the bundle branches to the Purkinje fibers, and that kicks it and spreads it all through the ventricles. So what's going to happen is, when our heart beats, the atria receive the electrical signal first, so they contract first. The AV node delays it and then spreads it through the ventricles so that the ventricles can contract. So what we get here is we get a system where our heart has, the top of the heart is going to be able to contract because it receives the signal first. Then it relaxes, and then the ventricles receive the signal, so they contract, and then they relax. And there's a delay. The atrioventricular node actually delays the sending of the signal so that the atria can contract and then relax, and then the signal is moved through the ventricles, through the bundle of His, bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers to cause the ventricle to contract, and then the ventricle can relax, and that's one heartbeat. So every heartbeat, we have to move the electricity, the action potentials, through the heart in this order. If things get screwed up, we go into something called like fibulation. And fibulation is where we're not conducting the signals properly through the heart in this order. And the heart just starts to just twitch like this. And that's called fibulation. And if the heart's fibrillating, we have to do kind of a Control-Alt-Delete, reboot the heart, and that's what a defibrillator does, right? So a defibrillator, when they zap a person with a defibrillator, it actually doesn't start your heart, it stops your heart. And it stops all this. And your heart stops, and what they're waiting for is the cyanoatrial node to kick in and start that fundamental beat again to establish this pattern of electrical movement. And so our heart, when it's not beating properly, that defibrillator does not start your heart up again. It actually stops it so that your heart can reset. The cyanoatrial node can start sending the proper signals that then spread through your atria, your atrioventricular node, your bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, and hopefully you'll get a normal rhythm again. Now, if they defibrillate a person and the normal rhythm isn't established again, then they do it again. This is also why someone who doesn't have a heart condition cannot be near the defibrillator, because if you accidentally defibrillate someone who is not in need of it, it'll stop their heart. And so obviously having a stopped heart is not a very good thing. So we need to reestablish this rhythm, this pattern. Now that's what kind of this video, or this not video, but this handout is kind of showing us here on the next slide of your PowerPoint. That's what I'm trying to say. So the SA node fires at about 90 to 100 times per minute, but it slows down in the AV node, and that allows the heart to fill with blood. A person that needs an artificial pacemaker is a person where the SA node is not functioning properly. Either it's beating too slow, it's beating too fast, something is going on, and we need to establish a normal rhythm. That leads us to a couple of disorders like sick sinus syndrome. It says that abnormally functioning SA node, maybe it's beating really slow, and then it gets on track, and then it beats too fast, and then it beats too slow. So irregular heartbeat is known as sick sinus syndrome, and that's where we may need an artificial pacemaker that they establish, a fundamental beat. It says extra beats forming at other sites of the heart that doesn't start at the SA node and move through can cause what's called ectopic pacemakers. Now, ectopic pacemakers are where certain areas of the heart that should be waiting for the signal from the cyanoatrial node generate their own kind of independent action potential. And this can be disastrous, because if an area of your heart starts to generate action potentials arbitrarily, just on their own, it can spread through the heart, and that's when you get the fibrillation. It says on your PowerPoint slide that nicotine and caffeine can cause ectopic pacemakers. This is not good. This is why every once in a while you'll hear a story where someone, drank a lot of caffeine, like those Monster drinks, and then they died because they had heart failure. What happens is that caffeine can cause ectopic pacemakers, these inappropriate action potentials that mess up our conduction system. And when the heart is not moving the electricity in this order, then the heart just goes into fibrillation. And if you don't have a fibrillator nearby, the person can die. That's why, gyms and hospitals and schools all have defibrillators now. Because if a kid, chugs 6 Monster drinks at lunch and then has an ectopic pacemaker, maybe we can save that person if we have a defibrillator, because our heart's just twitching like this, and then we've got to stop it with the defibrillator, wait for our cyanoatrial node to reset and establish a normal beat again. This is also a pretty common thing with heart attacks. So a person has a heart attack, a part of their heart is starved of oxygen, and develops a ectopic pacemaker, and then that heart can go into defibrillation. So they think they have a heart attack victim stabilized, and then he goes into defibrillation because of ectopic pacemakers. So that's just another example of that. And so the rhythm of the conduction system is set by the SA node. All right. Now, the action potentials of a heart is really the same almost as the action potentials of your skeletal muscle. It does say that an impulse through the heart has something called a plateau. And if we go back to chapter 10, if you remember in chapter 10, we've got an action potential that looks very much like our diagram at the top of Handout 20B. So the cyanoatrial node is making a pretty typical action potential. Remember, an action potential has depolarization followed by repolarization. But the ventricles of the heart have what's called a plateau. And this plateau is a delay before we repolarize. And that delay allows the blood to fill in the heart. So what you're seeing here on Handout 20B on the right side are the action potential graphs for the different parts of the heart. So the atria have a pretty typical action potential where we have depolarization followed right by repolarization. But as we move into the ventricles, we have this plateau. We call it the refractory period. And this plateau allows blood to exit the heart before we can have another action potential. And so that's what this says. The refractory period of the cardiac muscle fiber is longer than the contraction itself, and this allows the blood to fill the heart and exit the heart. Now don't worry about tetanus. It says tetanus cannot occur in myocardial cells, and so you can't have tetanus, which is perpetual muscle contraction in a heart muscle. Okay, so I believe this is a good stopping point for this video. So I'm going to pause it, and that takes care of not all of Handout 20B, by the way, because part of it is the EKG that's at the bottom, and I'll talk about an EKG, I believe, in our next video. So have a good day, and I'll see you in class soon.